Hey Stuart, welcome to the Working Wellbeings podcast, this impromptu episode of the Working Wellbeings podcast. Lovely to have you along.
No worries. Good to see you again, as always.
Yeah, so we've known each other for a number of years, and I'll get you to introduce yourself very shortly. Tell the people who are listening a little bit more about your background. But this, like I said, impromptu podcast was really because I've got a specific thing that I wanted to talk to you about, and I'm not sure where this conversation is going to go, but I think that's fine. But I was wondering, rather than me kind of trying to talk about this subject, which again I'll explain in a second, on my own, I thought it'd be great to have a conversation about it. So,
Yeah.
so who are you, Stuart? Tell for the
Well,
audience.
yeah,
What's
always
your
good.
background?
Always good to share thoughts and ideas and throw them around and see what comes out. Briefly, my background is I'm a health and fitness science graduate. Worked in health and fitness for the first part of my career. Really, I guess, understanding the commercial sides of business, managing teams and what have you. And then, as most people do, I fell into recruitment after I kind of lost my mojo with health and fitness, and had a 17 odd year career in recruiting on an agency side as well as a internal side, again managing systems, but more along the line, managing people and systems and process, but more along the line of managing stakeholders. And around 3 or 4 years ago, probably where our paths started to cross, made the move across into occupational health and wellbeing, or workplace health and wellbeing, which is where I'm at today, and the health and wellbeing lead for a construction company called Skanska in the UK.
Good.
And yeah, I've recently completed my masters in workplace health and wellbeing. When I say I've completed it, I've handed in all the work I needed to do. Haven't got my grade yet, so touching wood, but it will be fine. And that was a occupational health psychology research degree over a 3 year period, and yeah, it takes a lot of brain power and a lot of time to complete, but probably one of the top best 5 decisions I've made in my life.
Yeah, yeah, I've heard really good things about that course. By the way, I spoke to
Yeah,
the course leader of that
Jonathan. Yeah,
recently. Yeah, and
Jonathan. Yeah, yeah,
absolutely,
lovely,
absolutely.
yeah, lovely chat. It's if we're going to talk about that, it's I can't recommend it highly enough. It is expensive. It's over, it's 10.5, £11,000, or in fact, it's probably more now. It's around about 15 hours of study a week. Um, but my motivation to do it was having fallen out of a career where I kind of been there and done that and knew much about anything to do with recruitment after 17 years. Lots of skills and lots of experiences that can be brought across to workplace health and wellbeing. But I didn't feel I had the competence or the confidence to speak with authority and credibility in this space. So I took various other courses to build up to that course. I remember we started in 2021, so there was still kind of in a lockdown. And I remember our induction, which was done virtually, and the cohort, we were like rabbits in headlights. Because to be fair, I think in my intake there was one student that was in their 20s.
Mm.
I think there were probably about two in their 30s, and the rest were 40 plus. And we're kind of like, we're here to do a masters, and it's kind of like we've got to do some academic writing, and it was kind of, and there's a whole different range. There's obviously health and wellbeing leads, but there are people coming from occupational therapy type backgrounds, people who are just coming from health and safety. But Jonathan, yeah, he really does make you believe you can do it, and you can do it. And the course is set up in such a way that it's very difficult to fail.
Okay.
And that doesn't mean to say that it's easy to pass. By no means is it easy to pass. Not that I've passed yet, but it's very follow the process. And the one thing that was said on that first induction was that there's no right or wrong answers, and that kind of like, so to give the premise, there are 7 modules. One is a research project which you can do in your second year, but I did mine in my third year, And those modules, you ask a question, and you have basically 13 weeks to write an essay on answering that question. But you're not to necessarily give a conclusion. It's critical thinking, and you go look for the research to back up what your thoughts are on that question. So you're not told what to write. You're guided. Maybe look at this theory. When you look at stress within work, go and look at job demands, or go and look at effort reward imbalance and that sort of stuff. But you don't have to, and therefore you got that freedom to say, okay, I like this, or I think this would be valuable because. However, there's a body of evidence to say, or literature to say, this doesn't work, and therefore you just create that thought process around making up your own mind about what you think is genuinely going to be supportive of organisations or not. And once you realise that, it becomes so enjoyable, and then you can start really geeking out with Jonathan and your other cohorts and people like yourself, around that whole sort of health psychology, occupational health psychology. And then you just go, you get embroiled, you go down rabbit holes, you have unconscious streams of conversations like we're having now. But it's not a course that I suggest somebody jumps into straight away. There does, I think, need to be a little bit of groundwork in play before realising actually what you're getting yourself into. But it certainly has helped me find work, and it's certainly helped me in work.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's really interesting. Yeah, it's good to hear about, actually, because obviously, the audience for this podcast, there'll be a lot of people who are in this space, maybe have not done that sort of learning, but that could be useful for. So yeah, it's great to hear about. I tell you what, you mentioned that it teaches you about going down rabbit holes, so I wondered whether we could go down this rabbit hole that I've got planned. So I kind of alluded to it in the intro, and I'll do a couple of provisos before we jump in. So my first big caveat to this is not a political podcast. I promise you, I do not want to talk too much about politics because I'm worn out from that for the last few weeks. So that's not what this is about. However, the inspiration for this podcast episode, and like I said at the start, it was a bit impromptu because it came up from a kind of a thought that I'd had maybe last week, the week before. I was going to say I read all the party manifestos. I didn't read them all. I stuck them in ChatGPT, so that's slightly cheating. But I stuck them in ChatGPT. And obviously the bit I'm interested in is around workplace wellbeing. So my questions to ChatGPT around the manifestos were, what do they say about workplace wellbeing in any kind of form? And the short answer is not very much at all. And it just got me thinking. Now the other caveat and the other elephant in the room, which you actually brought up when I first raised this with you, is, which is a very fair point. Is there a correlation between manifesto promises and what actually happens in real life? And I don't think that is a rabbit hole that we should go down, but I think it's a very fair point. I think it's a very fair point. But I guess we come back to this original question of, why is there no mention of that, given that the vast majority of people in the UK are in a job? They are, they spend a huge amount of their time at work. And not only why is it not there, but I guess should it be? And again, we can get into this, but I started looking at whether there are other governments around the world who do take more of an interest in the workplace and how it operates within their countries. And again, the short answer is yes. I don't think anyone's got the perfect solution to it, but it just struck me that the UK seems quite hands off. Although saying that, last thing I will say, sorry, before I stop rabbiting on, is that the Labour Party were probably, out of all the parties, and again, this isn't a political statement, but they were probably one of the parties who, and having since won, seem to be talking a little bit more about the workplace. But my only thought about it is it's about the bare minimums. So it's about how do we eradicate 0-hour contracts? How do we, look at things that just for me a kind of bare minimum, like Maslow hierarchy of needs, like that should just be done. and it might not be being done, but what about all the other stuff in terms of enhancing people's well-being? I don't know.
Yeah, well, they're notoriously their foundation. I'm not well. Before I'll caveat, obviously, I'm not into politics at all, realistically, and I've tried to shy away from it. I mean, this election, I try to shut it off. But from what I think I know, notoriously, I think, or famously, Labour Party are for the working class, aren't they? And that for the working person in the street.
Yeah.
And are trade union positive, shall we say? And I think that's something we've seen diminish under the last government, I should say now. I think why wasn't it in manifestos? I don't know if it's a vote winner. And coming back to that point around what goes in a manifesto and what actually happens, they're sales brochures, aren't they? It's almost clickbait. It's we're gonna look at that, and where are the 60 hospitals that Boris Johnson promised, and all that sort of stuff. So whether or not they thought it was going to get them across the line, they didn't need it clearly with the majority. But I do think the government, whoever it will be, will need to wake up to how organisations have an impact on society. I think that's got to be the case. I went to a launch event, I think they called it, for the Health Foundation at the beginning of this year. I think it was February time. And Nick Powell was there from Society of Occupational Medicine. He was the only person I knew, funny enough. And I thought I'd see other health and wellbeing leads and people from organisation, and it weren't. There's a whole collective of people. But the event was basically they were doing a chart. They were launching a charter into looking at how, in a short way, how they can make work good for us, which is my attraction to it, because that's what I'm all about. I was talking to Nick afterwards, and one or two other people, and what we've noticed, and you've seen this, I think a chap called Gethin Nadine's been advising the government, or certainly the Treasury as well, is that the Treasury are now getting involved and asking questions, because we're starting to see a rise in economic inactivity. People are sick, not even looking for work. Absenteeism is on the rise. Organisations, we've got. We are more sick now than we've ever been, for longer. We move less and we eat more and we eat rubbish. So therefore, if the trajectory continues, we're not really going to have a workforce. People they're just not going to be well enough to work. So the government's going to have to do something about it, and I think they are. I think they're starting to look at various measures, whether that be through occupational health. I don't think they know which way to go, hence the reason why they have various charters or various commitments or various projects running. But I can't think, it can't be ignored for much longer. No. The fact that the way I see it is that work is a determinant of mental health and physical health, and organisations can play a massive part and have a ripple effect in society. And in a previous employment, when I was a strategic client manager for what they quoted the biggest private employer in the UK, if that organisation had 300,000 employees, if they were able to shift the needle from a health and wellbeing, physically and mentally perspective, on even half of that workforce, that's 150,000 people, that has a ripple effect to their families, and that will have a ripple effect to their friends and society as a whole. So I do feel that organisations can and should play a huge part in how society is shaped, along with the government and various other, I suppose, parties, whether that be media or religion or education or whatever. So organisations working hand in hand with the government, we do it all the time, but I do think that this does need to be something that needs to be on the agenda, and whether or not it's seen as a vote winner just yet, not sure. But I think that there could be an element in this matter around self-awareness, and when we start to look at our politicians and their own health and well-being and how hard they work, or how much they spend at work, how much time they spend at work or don't, as the case may be, that sort of stuff, and then we're getting into their characters and their beliefs and stuff.
Well, you'll have seen that story, won't you, about Keir Starmer and a media storm around whether he was going to work Friday afternoons or not, Friday evenings. And when I saw that story, I just thought, the thing that really struck me is, why is that even a story?
Why
is it such a big? Why is this such a big? And then you got the back and forth that you always get with these things, So he should be working into the evenings on a Friday, and then why? It's more about his work-life balance and all that. And I was just like, why are we even having this conversation? Why is this even a thing? And the fact that it's even an issue of someone saying that they don't want to work past 6 on a Friday afternoon, when he blatantly would, if there was like an important thing that he needs to pick up. That just goes to show, doesn't it, that we're like, there is something inherently built into the workplace that, we can say all these things about positively affecting people's well-being, but when it comes down to it, we still retain some of these views.
Yeah, well, I was with you when it first came out, and in fact, I didn't go too much into it. I saw it, and I wasn't really that interested in it because maybe I'm getting old and grumpy and cynical about life, Matt, and I see a lot of things as just being distractions, and I just saw that as a distraction. I don't know what it was distracting us from, but and again, it was pretty much focused on the individual, which again, we've got to be looking at organisational solutions, for organisational problems, as opposed to individual solutions for individual problems. I see a lot of it in the well-being. You see a lot of it in the world, to be fair, but I'm often kind of I see workplace health and well-being is complex and all this sort of stuff. You hear all this sort of noise. But actually, let's cut to the chase. Let's get rid of these distractions. Ultimately, is work helping somebody's physical and mental health? And if it's not, let's do something about it. If it is, and people thrive, then let's reward them and let's continue on that pathway.
So just very quick, they're the questions we should be asking. It's how do we move into that more proactive space? Because you mentioned that long-term sickness and economic inactivity being the trigger for. So the only mentions, when I looked at the ChatGPT reading of these manifestos, the only mentions of anything well-being adjacent was that. So it was more people are getting sick. Long-term sickness, I looked at the numbers, is up from 2 million 5 years ago to creeping towards 3 million. So that's bad. But the headlines or the suggestions for how to solve that tended to be around how do we target that 3 million and get them back into work, and the welfare system and all this sort of stuff. It wasn't, and again, I looked this number up, I didn't know this off the top of my head, it wasn't looking at the 33 million other people who are currently employed but not on long-term sick, and whether they could become long-term sick in the future, or what could we do to help them. And that's what you're talking about there, right? How do we move into this much more preventative, proactive space with this stuff, rather than how do we treat the symptoms?
Yeah, absolutely, and that comes down to root cause and what have you. But that's the issue, though. That's one thing, isn't it? It's kind of like similar to what we were saying before we recorded around looking at compartmentalising things. So we know that there's going to be a cost associated with those 3 million that are potentially could work but not in work, and if there are 33 million, that's what, even 1%. So you kind of we're focusing on this 1%, which need to have a focus, but then there's that aspect of that 1% is going to become 2%, and then 3% as if we don't start looking at actually what's creating that that flow. And they're two separate things, as you rightly say, and then you're kind of looking at that proactive or preventative piece. And one thing that the thought that's been going around my head for, it's probably about a year now, and I have read a few things, and I have listened to a few books around, and it's been brought up in books around loss aversion, as in it's more, that there's more power, or we feel losing something greater than gaining something. And coming on to a bit of a football theme, which unfortunately is always going to come into every conversation that you and I have. When I was working for Vitality, Vitality sponsor Bournemouth. It's called the Vitality Stadium, and the manager at the time was Gary O'Neill. I think he's up at Wolves now. I was doing a pretty decent job there, but he was also doing a good job at Bournemouth, and he did a pod with Vitality, and he was saying how he was really very articulate and speaks a lot of sense. But they were talking about this sort of psychosocial, the mental health side of being a manager, and he was basically saying a loss, I'm just ruined for the weekend, and my family know it and just don't come near me. But it affects him more than a win. And the win is almost glossed over. We go into training on the Monday. We've got to win. Everyone's feeling good about it, but the loss affects us more. And then there was this book I was listening to just recently, as I mentioned earlier, Thinking Fast and Slow by Dr. Daniel Kahneman, and he was then looking at actually throughout the book he did some research, and he's basically saying that a loss of $1 feels like a gain of $2.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
the same emotional response to.
Yeah, and again, this was something that started to come up when I was at Vitality, and I've been thinking about that. And it's kind of, again, I hate to say it, I'll bring it back to the football piece. It's kind of the old thinking of Sam Allardyce, for those who know their football, is we start a match with a point. So in football, if you don't lose, you get a draw, you get a point. If you lose, you get nothing, and if you win, you get 3 points. But you start every game with something. Let's not lose that, and that's the sort of the motivating factor. If we win, great. And when we look at kind of what you just mentioned there, we've got 33 million, who are in work, and we've got 3 million out of work, or whatever the figure is. So it's kind of like, let's not lose that 33 million in the workplace. So we've got to then be proactive and preventative with regards to keeping them in the workplace in a sense. So we've got to work just to stay on an even, just to keep our, stay on an even keel. And that's where I think organisations, government should potentially, look at that with regards to, it's the prevention of harm, physical and mental harm, and then how do we make well-being, promote well-being and promote good work, and obviously how do we then look after the sick, which is the integrated model, which Tony Lamatania and Kat Ryan and what have you came up with, that integrated approach. But it doesn't need to be one or the other, and I do find that sometimes that's what it kind of is. Well, we're going to focus on the sick and manage them, as we're probably doing here with the 3 million. So let's just focus on that. Well, okay, that's fine, but let's look at root cause. Let's actually understand how we can manage the harm prevention and manage it well and do it properly, not just policies and and systems and procedures. It's actually, we're looking at what's going on, what's actually happening. Are we actually doing it?
Well, my other thought around that, and I completely agree, my other thought around that is whether we could be more ambitious and creative with it as well. Because I mentioned briefly before, that for example, I read just yesterday that the Labour Party I can't remember what they're branding it up as, like a new approach to work, but it's focused on 0 hours contracts, supporting disabled workers, preventing bullying and harassment, and ensuring fair pay. And I'm like, yes, all those things are good. Like, absolutely, we
Yeah,
should make sure that no one's getting bullied and that disabled workers are supported and so on and so forth. Fine. But what about the huge amount of employees who aren't affected by those specific issues
yeah,
but are still stressed out as a
yeah,
result of workload, burnout,
yeah,
relationships, lack of control, lack of resources, these
yeah,
sorts of things. We're not, but I guess, and we can get onto this, then the question is, how do you influence those things?
yeah,
Because, I am not advocating here, I do not think, for a government intervention that takes the reins away from corporations and forces them to be, I'm not, forces them to be positive to their employees. I'm not advocating for that, but there must be ways, through policies, perhaps legislation, that they could influence workplaces and employers around some of those other,
yeah,
topics that I talked about. So absolutely do the
yeah,
bullying and harassment and the disabled workers and
yeah,
0 hours, got sort that out. I'm not saying we don't need to
yeah,
do that, because the people who are affected, and again, we had a conversation about this, didn't we, in the context of pay. Like, if you're not getting paid enough, that is incredibly stressful. The moment you get up to a point where
yeah,
actually you're not thinking about it every day, then it has diminishing returns. So you
yeah,
can't keep paying people more and they'll get happier
yeah,
and happier. So those things that I talked about before, your bullying and your whatnot, they're the things that we need to get up to that plateau point,
yeah,
right, where it's not causing
yeah,
harm to people. But then what about all the other things that,
yeah,
that are
yeah,
affecting everybody in the
yeah,
workplace?
and
And
that,
how
and
can we
that,
influence that? I guess
yeah,
that's a million dollar question.
yeah, and that equity piece, isn't it? Um, I, so I'm going to bring where I go with this when I do think about it. I end up thinking about me, myself,
Mm.
whether that's narcissistic or whether that's selfish or what have you. But I kind of think around what would motivate me, what and whatnot. Now, when it came to this election, I wasn't really interested. In fact, I haven't been interested in politics for a while because I don't buy the politicians. In fact, I know where this started. This actually, I hate to say this, and again, I'm going to bring it back to football, but it was over the whole Hillsborough thing back in the 80s, Matt, and this is how far back my thought process go, where, how that came out and what happened then versus where we are now and how the Sun got involved and what have you. And again, for those people who are not really aware, is there was a tragedy at a football stadium in the 80s in an FA Cup final, and the government and the press basically pointed the fingers at football hooliganism and blamed the fans, when realistically it wasn't their fault, and people died and there's been lots of a huge cover-up. But that gives the sort of premise that I don't have any faith, belief, trust in people who are running our country. And when you hear around what happened around COVID and Partygate and all this sort of stuff, you just think they're not looking after themselves. I mean, I don't care. They're just they're where's the values in that and where's the trust? And I think we've heard of stories of bullying, and we hear stories of one rule for one and one another rule for another, and that whole, as I say, piece of me maybe getting old and grumpy, but that's where I think it needs to start. They need to look at themselves. As I said, I'd look at myself whenever things come about. Right, let's look at me now. For government, let's look at now. If we're going to look at putting policies and helping organisations and what have you. Unless it's financially incentive, I don't think organisations are going to do anything about it. Because we know the HSE don't really go around saying to
Auditing people.
yeah. Having said that, with the laws that have been passed in Australia in the last 2 years ago, and the steps they've made, certainly in the literacy of psychosocial risks and what have you, I'm hopeful we will follow. We generally do. I think mental health first aid started over in Australia, and we saw this how that came into the UK post pandemic.
Yeah.
But I think back to the point, I think how if this is the answer, or a answer or a solution, is how do we get hold of the government themselves or people working in government and say, look, you know, I mean, if we went and did a stress risk profile, right, on the, you know, Houses of Parliament, Houses of Common, people working in the cabinet, people who work in the ministry, you know, ministry, or any sort of, you know, civil servants. Well, in fact, we know there's swathes of literature, of research and evidence that, you know, on civil servants, and you know, we can see the issues are there. It's then, how do we make it economically viable, I guess. Whether or not it's the right way to go, I don't know, because should we be driven by money, or should we actually be driven by the right thing to do? If we can make them both, then that's, you know, that's a win-win. But my viewpoint, Matt, was that we need to try and get the ear of influencers in the government to sort of say, we've got to be looking at ourselves. Do they believe in, you know, in it themselves, and you know, if they start to see the goodness or the positivity of it, then you'd like to think they'd roll it out. But again, that might be a utopian world in my head.
Yeah, I mean, look, on a level, I agree with you that they should be role modelling. And, you know, I think about this with organisations that I've worked with as well. You know, it always comes back to, well, what are they doing on the top team? And, you know, at the board level, you need to role model. And I'm like, I understand that, and I agree with that. There are points, however, where you just think, where I think, do you know what? I'd be quite happy they can do whatever they like. Like, I don't really feel that way. Like, I don't want people who are excessively stressed out. But, you know, if we is there a way of just removing that and saying, look, I know that they're not role modelling the correct behaviours, but is there still something that they could do to influence organisations outside of that? Perhaps. I mean, I think you both would be better. But is there some way of influencing it? And like I said, come back to before, you know, being ambitious and creative with it. So the one that people bring up, which I've got to be honest, I don't know how successful or how it's implemented. I don't know enough about it. But this right to disconnect, you know, that they introduced in France a few years back, and I believe has been taken up by another couple of EU countries, and I think Labour are looking at it as well. So it kind of, but. You know, I don't know what the evidence behind that and whether it's worked and all the rest of it, but the reaction you get from people, everyone's really interested in it because they're like, oh, right, yeah, this is a stress that I have because I work evenings, you know, that I'm affected by, and it affects probably, I don't know, 90% of people in the workplace. So this affects me, and this is something that, far more people are affected, I think, by working in the evenings than are affected by bullying and harassment, for example. I think that's true, and that's not to say that one's not important, the other is, but I'm just saying it affects a lot of people, and people are really interested in that. And there's other examples. I went on the hunt. So there's one in Japan. They've got, so I don't know if you've heard of this. They've got something they call the Premium Friday Initiative. So where they encourage businesses to end work at 3 p.m. on the last Friday of each month. Now, again, from what I read in my limited research around that it hasn't been quite as successful or as followed as they would like it to be. But these are the sorts of things that I just wonder. Like, these feel more creative. And the 4-day working week, the research that's been doing around the 4-day working week, these seem more ambitious, creative ways of trying to solve some of these issues rather than playing at the edges. I don't know.
Again, though, I think though that yes. So I agree they are potentially creative, but I'm going to come back. I think there's distractions, and I see why there's noise about them, but I think we've got to start looking at root cause. Why do we need to have a right to disconnect? Do you know what I mean? So what is it? So organisations are 24 hours, or they're pushing emails when people are out of work, knowing that they're out of work. So I know that it's outside their working hours. Well, don't push emails outside working hours, or don't expect somebody to reply. Is it a manager sending an email, you know, to somebody who's working flexibly? That manager shouldn't really be sending an email outside of their working hours. yeah, again, this all comes back to me around, relationships. A lot of my thinking, comes back to the HSE management standards when you're looking at risk within organisation. It's one of the modules that in one of my master's modules we looked at stress in organisations, and I took those standards apart and put them back together again. They stand up. They're quite rigorous, and I know it's HSC and people go, "Oh, it's the government" and what have you, but the people behind putting them together, knew what they were doing. And 45,003 has grown off the back of that, and I will obviously carry out and say it's just looking at causes of stress or psychosocial risk. It's not it's not interventions or implementations, but it's a start point. But yeah, to your point, I question why we need to do that, and let's look at root cause of. And if we look at those 6 aspects of things within the standards, you generally are going to find that it's in there, and if somebody has to work outside of their hours, then that's a demand or role clarity, or there's lack of control or whatnot. That needs to be looked at. Not let's stop somebody from working outside of their hours. The thing being with that, Matt, is also just because somebody is away from their working environment physically and potentially has logged off after a working day, there's that psychological detachment piece as well. It doesn't mean to say they're not thinking about work. And if you know an email's but they're waiting, you're probably going to, I've got to go and answer that. Or, there's a piece of work that, needs doing and what have you, and you may log on at the weekend just to get it done. Again, you've got to question your sort of demands and controls. But that's not necessarily a bad thing if if I get this done, I'm actually going to feel better for the rest of the evening or the rest of the weekend or whatever it might be. So I do think there's that.
I agree with you. I'm not holding up right to disconnect or Premium Friday or any of these things as the solution. I don't think they are the solution. But all I think I'm talking about or trying to say or trying to think about is that feels to me like a more creative way of trying to solve an issue that exists, rather than let's just get these 3 million long-term sick people back into work by making the welfare system more difficult to
sludge, basically.
That is purely focused on the symptom. And what I'm saying is there's something we can do to focus on the cause, and there have been things that have been done at that level that affect, for example, health. So you look at smoking or drinking. Smoking is probably the best example, that the numbers have hugely come down. Now, that's not been perfect, because it's in a lot of ways it's just been replaced with vaping, and whether that's a whole other issue and all the rest of it. But if one way of looking at it is that smoking is bad. We have done things as a country, and it has brought smoking down. So if there are other things like that, working 80 hours a week is bad. Like, how can we bring that down?
Well, I'm going to push on that slightly and say, well, is working 80 hours a week bad? Now, again, we're coming back to actually purpose, and is work good for us? And I've seen various people come down on different sides of it, and is work, does it then become an obsession, or are you a workaholic, or are you addicted to work or addicted to email and what have you? Just coming back to your point, before I forget, I think I read this through these numbers came out through lockdown around those people who could work from home and couldn't. And it's more than half our workforce in the UK cannot work from home.
Right.
So the issue being therefore is that they're on site there, or key workers, and therefore, in a sense, when their time finishes at work and they leave work, they finish work. In fact, my wife was in that sort of scenario where she didn't work. She never worked from home. So when she had a computer, not a laptop, and she didn't have a mobile phone. So so there is a huge part of our working workforce that this doesn't affect, and that's another thing we've got to be sort of conscious of. And in my role with Skanska construction company, when subbies are off site, they're off site. And this is one of the things we're looking at with regards to how to communicate to people who we don't provide mobile phones for them or email addresses for them. So there are a lot of the working population that actually the right to disconnect wouldn't.
It doesn't make a difference.
So you're back to your point there of we're looking at just the minority, which is again not a problem, but let's kind of look at that doesn't solve a huge problem with burnout or exhaustion and work overload. So there is that aspect. The point I was making previously, I've forgotten. So I've lost my train of thought, and I'm hoping you can remember.
Maybe not.
But yeah, I do think that if you're going to look at bringing in a intervention, there does need to be an element of theory behind and science behind actually what are we likely to find, or what is it likely to happen, and then how well it's implemented is obviously important on that space as well. But again, it's better to have an objective and the theory behind it than, as I sort of alluded to earlier, than putting your finger in the air and seeing which way the wind's blowing.
Yeah. Well, I guess the other thing, that comes to my mind is you are right. I'm with those things that I'm suggesting. I'm hunting for this utopian solution. Like go 4-day working week will suddenly mean that nobody's ever stressed again, and there's a single intervention or a single thing that we can do. And where the smoking analogy breaks down is it's a lot simpler, I think. Like, you either smoke or you don't smoke. Whereas the workplace is so much more complex. There's so many other different things that could cause you stress. It's not a single point of stress or a single risk to your health and all the rest of it. So it's a lot more of a complex. So I guess the other thing that comes to my mind is, and I do know that this is something that has been explored by previous governments, because it was David Cameron's Conservative government that brought this in I think 2010. The ONS have been measuring gross national well-being for or levels of life satisfaction and all the rest of it. Now, why has that not been used, as far as I can tell, to influence public policy or measure public policy? Or, we seem to be still obsessed with GDP and productivity, and that's just been completely silent. Although we're still collecting the data, the data's still there. It's fascinating. The data, I love that data.
The rise of capitalism, mate. And coming back to your point, I remember what your last point was with regards to working an 80-hour week, and my argument back to you would be, well, if work is good for you and you're thriving off that, what's the point? I wouldn't say it's an addiction, but you're kind of like, this 4-day working week. My argument is, well, do your demands reduce by 20%, because you're asking people, unless you're asking people to do less work in those their outputs, should I say, are less within the. But if work is good for you, why would you want less of it? And my brother's a pilot, right? So for a private, not commercial, and he loved to fly. He would fly every single. Of course, you need boundaries and parameters around it. But if I was to say to him, "Hey, do you want to fly 80 hours a week?" He would, Now, whether or not you're getting sufficient recovery, and that would be part and parcel of it, and what have you, but it's feeding off that. Now, let's be realistic about it. There are a lot of crappy jobs out there. There are a lot of people who are dissatisfied with their work, don't like work. Happy Fridays around, hey, it's the last working day of the week, we've got the weekend and all that sort of jazz and corporate stuff. But it's kind of like, again, let's do no harm first and foremost, because if we can't make work good for people, which we should be looking to do, if we can't make work good, let's not make it worse. But yeah, again, is that whole aspect of does it fuel you, does it fill you, does it give you that purpose? And I think, and again, going off on on a tangent here with regards to what the future looks like and future governments. I think a lot of this is going to be dictated, and I hopefully it is, because I'm a firm believer of our younger generation. I do think, what's branded as Generation Z and Generation whatever it's going to be called next, Alpha, I think is gonna drive policy. It's going to drive society. Workplaces have never changed in my working life, which is around 25 to 30 years. Workplaces have never changed as much as they have in the last 4 years. And when we start looking at understanding neurodiversity and inclusion and diversity within our organisations, it's going to be a far different place in 10, 20 years to what it was when I started working in the health clubs. And I remember my dad saying this to me when I got when I got that job. He would say, leave your baggage at the door. Yeah, and my dad's now in his 80s, so he was brought up after the war, during the war and what have you, and it's that sort of mentality. You can't do that. You can't just leave your emotions and your well-being outside of work in a box and then walk in and because well-being has an effect on work has an effect on your well-being, and so does your life. So you are that one person. So I do think when we start to look at measuring happiness versus productivity versus how much money a country earns, I could be wrong, because a lot of people have pushed back on this and it's made me change my thoughts. And the recent research project I did for my masters showed some interesting findings, as I felt. But I think the younger generation aren't working for the same reasons our previous generations were, and I don't think it's just driven by money nowadays. I think they are looking at organisations that do have a purpose, are probably going to be good for the planet from a sustainability point of view. What can I get, from working? Where does this advance my career? I just don't want money to pay a mortgage or to have a nice car, because I don't think they incentivise people anymore, because they're so far out. So it's more around, does this company align with my values? Are the company's values aligned with what I'm about? Are we around people, profit and planet, the B Corp stuff? And that's where I think if we are finding that politicians are becoming younger and coming through, that's where we might find, if we can get a government to, I don't know, we've got 5 years of Labour in theory. Do we get 10, 15? And that's the other thing about it, Matt. As I say, I think a lot of it's short-termism. It's trying to get let's just win the next election. So there isn't that long-term view, unless everyone is going to commit to it. I'm pretty conscious that Labour would have started some stuff under the Blair government, that Cameron would have come in, or if not Theresa May, well, maybe not Theresa May, I think we'd be in a far different position. Again, I talk about not knowing politics, but I think we'll be in a far different position if Theresa May was running the country post-Brexit and throughout the pandemic. But anyway, but there's a lot of things that I know the Conservative government would have just kicked into touch that the Blair government would have put, and vice versa. So, you got this Cameron thing, as you mentioned. Why aren't we looking at that? How do we get that on? How does that become the agenda? And again, I don't know the inner workings of the Houses of Parliament as to how that works, but what I would suggest is that if it's going to affect money, hence Treasury, that's where change probably happens. I hate to say it. And again, that's the rise of capitalism and the world we're kind of living in now, aren't we?
Yeah. Well, look, I think we should finish there, because we could probably keep on talking about this forever. To be perfectly honest, and I'm gonna call it there, because I felt a tinge of optimism with the last bit that you were talking about there, and this is something that I've come across, that generationally, we are just changing, and it's, the thing that frustrates you is that takes time. By definition, that takes time. You're talking years, generations, right? Rather than what will happen is this just shifts tomorrow. But yeah.
I think yes and no. I am very optimistic about our younger generation shaping our workforce for the better. But I think our younger generation is almost a now culture. It's a now generation. They want, and I think, as I sort of alluded to earlier, I think things have moved quicker in the last 4 years than they have done in the last 20 years. And I just think we are going to start. Now, coming back to where we sort of started, is all of this just noise? Does it tackle root cause? But I think we have to eliminate what doesn't work to get to what we do find what works. And for me, that's just building the scaffolding around. Actually, we can't go from the hard shoulder to the fast lane. We need to build that scaffolding and get us into a right place. And I do think the points that the younger generation are bringing to the table that organisations are being forced to look at, whether that again is neurodiversity or an inclusion or what have you, means the organisations are looking at it. And that's the thing. So they are getting, and they're getting some airtime. Now, some of it, as I say, may be just hot air, but I do believe within that, you're going to find that if you and I continue to preach to the converted and filter down to the younger generation in organisations, and we go in and we do our good workshops around stress, risk, and around working well and all that sort of good stuff, that is going to increase the health literacy, and hopefully as the tide rises, all the boats are going to rise. But as I say, I think Gen Z are not going to take any crap. I heard somebody describe that the Gen X were the idealists and Gen Z were the realists. And I do think they'll make change. And I think in 10 or 20 years' time, if we're still banging around this industry, we'll be like, wow, hopefully we'll be, brushed off our feet with so much work to do, but we'll be, be our utopia, and people will be happier and healthier for work. And I think that tide has to change. It's changing. I'm positive it's changing.
I think so. Yeah. But let's leave it there. Maybe we do need a part 2. I've really enjoyed having a conversation with you today.
As you know, I can go on, but we can. It may be be asked. Be good to see what the audience think with regards to just an unscripted type of just two mates having a chat about. In fact, this is a good opportunity to plug your wellbeing roulette chat. Chat roulette, shall I say? Because generally this is what happens when I connect with somebody I'm randomly selected with or paired with. We just end up having a chat for about an hour. And whilst it's maybe not me doing my day job, this puts me in a far better place from a wellbeing point of view to go and be motivated to do my work, and and be able to share my thoughts and processes and what's going out there with other people in work. And I think that's vitally important, because I do think organisations are trying to do the right things. A lot of them don't know how to, and this helps with regards to formulating thoughts and processes as to how to actually move things forward within organisations.
Absolutely. And for those who don't know, so we've got the Working Well community, and members of the Working Well community are invited to take part in monthly wellbeing chat roulette sessions where we match you with another member of the community. You catch up, have a conversation, put the world to rights, as we have just done on this short podcast. Okay, right. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for chatting with me today. Hopefully we'll do it again. Like I said, it'd be great to hear what the audience think. Let us know what do they say on YouTube. Let us know in the comments below. That's what we need to say. Let us know in the comments below. That'd be great to hear. Or if anyone else has got some magic utopian intervention that they want to offer up, I'll take it. But other than that, thanks and enjoy the rest of your day.
No worries. Cheers, Matt. See you soon.